Chinese cinemas annually play only domestic films from July to August, in a move aimed at protecting the domestic film industry. Many Chinese films have achieved great success during these periods. Box office takings for Wolf Warriors 2 are approaching 5.7 billion yuan, while some alternative films like 22 have also received widespread attention. However, when the month comes to an end, domestic movies often flop badly. So, is there a better way for Chinese movies to compete with Western films in the future? Film censorship has always been a thorn in the side of Chinese audiences. On the one hand, a lot of content is considered inappropriate to the broadcast regulators. On the other hand, the Chinese government has never officially adopted a film rating system. Why is this? How far are Chinese film industry standards from those of more established industries overseas? War is always a hot topic for the film industry. Why then are there relatively few films or television shows about the Korean War, the China-India border conflict, or the 79 years war against Vietnam? Director Feng Xiaogang has a reputation for shooting titles about modern history, and his new film, Youth, was scheduled for release during the National Day. However, this was recently cancelled. What are the reasons behind this?
Arguably, Chinese movies are struggling to survive both competition from Hollywood and domestic policy scrutiny. The latest online debate about the release of Youth, a movie by Feng Xiaogang about wartime romance, went viral overnight. The movie is a love story within an army art troupe against the backdrop of a border clash between China and Vietnam in 1979. How shall we look at issues of heroism, patriotism, and the appeal of humanity in the darkest days of the Cultural Revolution and during the period of social transformation? Today, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Teng Jimeng, Cultural Affairs commentator and film critic, and Duan Yanling, curator and founder, Neo Tata Future Hub. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Yanling and Jimeng, why do you think the movie has caused so much controversy?
I guess first of all, is the time. The time featured in the film is still rather sensitive time. I think we have younger generation has very little clue about that very short period of time. But all of us, I think we all remember that glory tainted by blood, that song, right, pay tribute for the time. So I think the time is a sensitive issue in my personal experience.
And your interpretation?
I agree. I think that Yanling is right. I think timing is kind of a problem. Secondly, I think this is also a very controversial film, reflecting upon the war against Vietnam back in 1979. It's a very controversial war. It was a war gone, in the long past. But then there's this is the director who tried to remind us that this war is still lingering on a collective psyche of this very generation, born in the 1960s and perhaps a little bit of the 70s. And secondly, I think that...
Are you saying that governments in both Hanoi and Beijing agreed in a consensus that we should let bygones be bygones, that border clash, that chapter of the history back in the late 1970s, because the two sides are talking in a constructive manner about the maritime disputes in the South China Sea, and therefore they should forget about the history. History should recede into insignificance.
Right, you are. I'm not a diplomat, but then I try to put it diplomatically. I think the film is not supposed to be in keeping with the general warmth of this very harmonious time between China and Vietnam.
But I'm afraid you guys are being a little bit too political, since there could be a strong factor of a competition during the golden days of the National Day holiday. There could be many competitors during this period. With the homegrown movie protection month over, I believe overseas competitors such as Hollywood blockbusters are finding their way aggressively into the Chinese movie market, and therefore perhaps Feng Xiaogang has fallen victim to this policy to protect overseas movies. What do you think?
I think there are like another two guesses. One might be that hostile competition, because there got to be someone even more powerful, more influential within that film market. You know, all of the fate of a film almost today determines the distribution channel and the time. So that golden week is so attractive. We know that people will put some muscles. But second, I was thinking that his last film, Pan Jinlian,
Right.
the same thing happened. So
I'm not Madame Bavaria.
Yeah, so I thought that could be also another, could be a
Publicity stunt.
publicity stunt as well. I mean, we don't want to put that kind of idea, but there's still, is there a possibility also there?
Western media has been always very critical and watchful about the so-called censorship coming from the state administration of press, radio, television, and movie. This time around, there's a voice from this administration denying their censorship. They said the release of this movie Youth has passed their policy scrutiny. Having said this, what do you think should be the most interesting part about the storyline?
Well, I think the most important part is that this young woman, who is very representative of that very generation, born in the 1960s, and spent their formative years in the 1970s, and perhaps a little bit of the 1980s. This young woman who survived the vicissitudes of the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976, and also her experience in joining voluntarily in this war against Vietnam, and also their very growing up story, their youth, and also the sacrifice of their youth in terms of achieving and perhaps helping the nation to survive and thrive during the early years of the reform era. I like the part of this young woman. She's surviving and thriving during this very part, and especially the last very episode when this young woman cursed this very city management person.
Using the F word in the Chinese language.
Yeah, that's right.
That's the turning point. But I'm afraid the very first turning point occurred when the protagonist, Liu Feng, was about to give a bear hug to the lady he loved quietly, and it happened to be found by colleagues of the same art troupe. And therefore, Liu Feng went into self-imposed exile, namely to be involved in the border clash with the Vietnamese in 1979. And he lost one of his arms, if not became a martyr. So what do you think of a love story that was twisted during the Cultural Revolution?
I like the idea that the director of that really, which generation, well, the fourth and fifth generation director will come to the age that they really have this courage to look back, but also it's not very remote in the memory. And I still personally think it's a very touchy time. Collectively, it is a very traumatic time for Chinese culture. As you mentioned before, we have this long history of putting history aside. But all this film just reminds me that, you know, love stories, war stories, that's just eternal terms for all the movies. But this particular one, I think, set this really sensible time and really raised our collective awareness.
But do you think there is a broader gap in your perception about the movie, since you were born in the 70s and he in the 60s? So
90s.
The way you examine the wartime stories back in the late 1970s could be very different one from another, and he would dwell upon the details of the war brutality, and you would believe this is a remote story that the younger generation in China would hardly pay serious attention to.
Well, absolutely. But then before I take your question, let me just clarify Yanling's age. She's in 99ers, and she's much younger, and there's a huge gap. It will be a huge gap, to put it in a bad way, right?
Between 70s and 90s in that range.
Right. And so my perception is radically different, perhaps, from Yanling. So I think the war is supposed to be this war, even if it is not supposed to be extolled. But then this is a war that features heroism, valor, military valor, and also sacrifice. I trust that Feng is too sentimental and too emotional in reflecting upon a time which is supposed to be trauma, which is trauma, which is very traumatic for that generation. But then it is not the reason for us to ignore the fact that the young people in this nation, and especially the 60th generation, wants to join the war. I mean, like the young woman joined the war voluntarily. Liu Feng joins the war voluntarily. I mean, we can say that they are dragged into war. I think there is a collective voluntariness on the generation's part to fight for the nation, and in a sense, and perhaps to forget
I'm
about
afraid
the
you
bad sides
were
of youth.
one step short of mentioning the real brutal truth for the two major characters to be involved in the war. In fact, they wanted to use war to identify themselves as being politically correct, as being acceptable by the mainstream society in the darkest days of the Cultural Revolution, which was characterized, unfortunately, by the leftist ideology.
Well, yes, I mean, like young, I mean, there's
only the war could let you, could give you the opportunity to become a hero, a
right,
national hero.
Right. Well, Liu Feng's story is about that. I mean, trying to, in a sense, seeking a new identity by means of war, by means of joining that war, and eventually he survived. I think it's almost like a nirvana that he eventually survived the war, even though he lost one arm, but then he becomes a hero. He becomes a hero again. And so, in a sense, it's about a transformative nature of this very generation, from peacetime kind of street-smart people, or maybe happy-go-lucky guy, now becoming a true national hero because of the war. And that war is a justified war because Vietnam overthrows this very sovereign state by violence, and Cambodia is one of our Cold War allies.
And do you think this story could be compared to Once Upon a Time in America somehow, although that American movie is about mafia in the 1950s and 60s. This movie is about a revolutionary story, of course, romance in the wartime. Is it about the nostalgia sentiments of those who were born in the 1950s? Because many accused Feng Xiaogang of presenting a story about his own life. It's about nostalgia. What do you think?
I think it has a lot to do with this very nostalgia thing. I mean, this guy born in the 1950s and in the so-called the military compound, the 军队大院, and like Jiang Wen and maybe even some of the fifth generation persons, directors, they have the huge nostalgia for this very compound, military compound, wearing the green uniform. And like me, I used to have an army cap, and with the stars, my dad is a professional soldier. And so it's all about the revival of the past glory, and perhaps a kind of a memory that maybe glorifies us, and maybe in a sense to make this very male chauvinist sentiment a little bit kind of powerful and relevant to a time which heroism is forgotten.
And Yanling should have asked the question, what the hell are you talking about? I can't understand what your flow of thoughts. Right?
I think
the chauvinism is something like raised my attention, so I'm like, okay.
Are you a fan of Feng Xiaogang's works?
I think so. I do think among that generation, he is truly a master of humorism, and he truly can make people, as soon as you hear his name, you know there's laughter in the cinema. You may even kind of guess you can have some bitter aftertaste afterwards. So I don't think it's shallow, as many people presume. I think he's definitely...
You were referring to his New Year film, right?
Yes. And but I was also thinking, you know, all these days, the moviegoers are younger generations,
right.
80s, 90s, even this millennium. So I believe that there must be two parts of the song. One is like they come to the age for the nostalgia, and always their work, their extension of themselves. So of course that's his reflection. But ultimately, maybe because there's a distance between the history, the younger generation might find this very exotic, something extremely. Because nobody talk about a cultural revolution. This is like a psychic in our collective memory that is nothing to touch. It's not to be discussed. We know all this cliche, traumatic story. So I think the storyline is not very sad, because we heard even much more tragic stories. But the idea is how to make the young people understand it in the right context.
Here is a big perception gap between people of your generation and of her generation. It seems, as Yanling argued, let's forget about the Cultural Revolution. Let's forget about the war. However, people of our generation, of our age, may say we must review very carefully the brutality, the crimes against humanity during the Cultural Revolution, and even the war atrocities. So, why do you think we have such a big difference, and do you think time would be the best therapy?
I think because we saw that and we experienced that, and that experience sometimes brings very, very unhappy, even painful memory. And for example, my family basically torn apart by the Cultural Revolution, with my dad stationed away out there in the mountains, and with my mom trying to bring up these two kids and try to survive the kind of a general lack of daily necessities. And so it's all about a past sometimes I've had mixed feelings about, and sometimes that you just cannot afford to forget, especially in sharp contrast to nowadays the happy, kind of a satisfactory, and with us being middle-aged, enjoying the comfort of life now. And so it's all about trying to look back and try to survive.
But forget about the generational gap, demographic changes. Isn't it an important part of traditional Chinese culture to have this heavy sense of history? And it's also an important part of Chinese politics. When you take a particular look at the China-Japan relationship, right, historical outlook is always the most embarrassing and most important obstacle that gets in the way of any serious improvement of the bilateral relationship. So,
I want to really just correct what I said. I think it's our habit, especially due to the political sensitivity, that we put this kind of history of a cultural revolution aside. But since I've personally been really into the really deep psychological healings, and the common practice of healing is revisit the pain. So revisit that time and go back there and then come back as a new person. So I do think this film will serve a purpose if it's really succeed in the depths and in that really trueness and to itself, his idea, and to the history. And for the collective trauma, it will maybe serve the purpose of healing. And that's kind of powerful.
And do you both agree that there are big differences between Feng Xiaogang and Zhang Yimou in terms of their cinematic language in depicting the social realities since the end of the Cultural Revolution, while Feng Xiaogang puts more emphasis on small potatoes and grassroots level realities? Zhang Yimou did the same. However, he carried a lot of political overtones in the satirical tone, right?
Yeah, the major difference, I think, between Feng and Zhang is that Feng always tried to build a story and sometimes personal drama, like this one, youth, against kind of a socio-political background without an overt political messages. But Zhang Yimou always built the story directly into that very socio-political events, like Coming Home. We see,
and perhaps Chen Kaige even went to the extreme in portraying the social realities.
Right, like in Farewell My Concubine back in the 1990s. And Zhang Yimou's, for example, Coming Home in 2014, when he actually still tried to deal with the healing process. To him, trauma remains a factor in stopping the nation from reflecting upon critically
and
of
in
that
fact,
very disaster.
I was shocked when the release of this movie, Coming Home, was approved by the administration of a movie, radio and television.
Well, of course, there's a lot of compromises, but then, of course, I think the critical power is out there. Remember, at the end of the film, see that the woman refuses to recognize the husband, and the amnesia remains out there because she never comes, in a sense, come back and to cope with that very past, that very traumatic past. So we still have a long way in terms of healing, and Feng actually contributes to this very healing process. But unfortunately, Feng's idea is some kind of a comedy and trying to play that very street smartness, and that was, to me,
that's personal style.
Yeah, kind of problematic.
Feng Xiaogang made many remarks upon hearing the news, the bad news that the release of Youth would be delayed and would be most likely put on the show after the National Day holiday period. One of the sentences that impressed the audiences and those who followed his maneuvers was, "I would continue to produce realistic movies or movies characterized with subject matters of realism.
Right.
Now, what does that mean in the broad context of the aggressive intrusion of Hollywood movies, which has an apparent penchant for digital technology like Transformer, Planet of the Apes? I mean, this kind of things really drove me mad. A man of my age is not a big fan of digital technology. That's too glossy. That's too glossy. Too far away from the real realities of our life.
Yeah, but I have an even bigger concern. It's about the contrary to the realness. This is the fakeness in the contemporary Chinese films and Chinese movies. All this is 小时代, all this new film really commercialized and designed to grab your money and to take your soul, and that's probably the problem that he's talking about. I don't think he talks so much against the Hollywood blockbuster, but those so-called movies these days.
You know, there is always an important adjective that comes before realism. It should be called critical realism.
Yep.
If you only talk about love stories in the urban areas or乡村爱情 the countryside love stories, then that's a matter of escapism from the real reality, don't you think so?
Yeah, I mean, if I may disagree a little bit with Yan Ling, and I think that Feng's realism is serious. It's something that we need to deal with seriously. And for example, one of the films that I lauded very much is 1942.
It's about the famine in 1942.
Absolutely. I mean, it's about this famine, this disaster due to this very war, due to the Japanese invasion of China. And I think this part of the history that needs to be reviewed and to be revisited for on the part of the younger generation, so that they can really understand what's going on the minds of this very generation. This is the very generation of the directors. The fifth generation, the fourth generation, including the sixth generation, are still making films about that war. And maybe this is too, that we, still have problem with Japan, because Japan...
I was not impressed by this movie because I didn't have the acute sense about the hunger and the famine. Because the protagonist looked very
1990s.
Yeah, he was not starving. Zhang Guoli, the major character. So physically, he didn't look like someone who's suffering from the starvation.
It's fictional.
So that's a devastating setback.
Well, Zhang Guoli is a landlord. He belongs to the landlord class in the film.
Yeah,
so he could be
better off.
Yeah, he could be better off than
I failed to have the immediate sense of hunger after watching this movie.
Right,
this could be a failure, right?
This is the problem with youth. Also the problem that Yan Ling points out correctly. The 90s, the millennium generation would not understand this. They choose not to understand, not to see this traumatic past, because even though there is a huge creative energy and investment into this very film, I think that youth has a problem. Even if it is released in December, it will be hard to appeal to this very generation because of hunger, humiliation, war. I think it is almost like, very much on par with perhaps sex or violence out there on the screen that younger generation would not, be appealed.
You got me wrong, Jimon. Perhaps you got me wrong. I'm the guy who tends to be emotional in the cinema. There are always touching moments when I could easily cry. I'm an emotional guy. The point of tears could be very low for me.
I remember that you cried in Aftershock.
But this movie failed to persuade me to cry, to be emotional.
No, it's not about a film to make you
cry.
But
it's meant to be a traumatic part of our memory.
Yeah, right, but this film is all about reviewing that past and try to be critical of that very regime, the Chiang Kai-shek regime, the Republican regime, in time of war and in time of saving the war-torn nation at the very time. And so it's about responsibility of the leadership. It's about the leadership, the responsibility against the foreign aggression.
Right. It's a time when the country was not only ravaged by the war against the Japanese, but also famine itself. Flooding threatened to stop the Japanese from their advancement, right?
That's right.
It's part of the story. So what do you think of Feng Xiaogang after the release of Youth? Will he continue to make realistic movies, or do you want to see more of the Hollywood?
I remember, I think he will definitely going to carry on. We always believe that the artist's work is only ashes of the artist. So he will continue to do things, and no matter what the results. But I don't think Hollywood is his enemy. I think it is this numbness of the public and this politically blind and those plastic aesthetics. That things going on in contemporary Chinese movie theater is bothering him. That's why he created something rather up to your face, and I'm really congratulating him for it.
Jimeng, do you believe the filmmakers of Feng Xiaogang's generation should be yesterday men, and we should encourage people like Wu Jing to emerge and surface to represent the future of China instead of always being nostalgic and review what the fifth generation of movie directors has achieved?
I think both. I think we should encourage both Wu Jing and Feng Xiaogang, and even the small-time director, I mean, to present a kind of a 100-flower competing sort of scene. I like that the Chinese film scene to be, in a sense, competing with various kind of flowers. Feng represents a flower that's supposed to be thriving, but then we should also have a flower from Hollywood. I mean, even though that's a flower from the dustbin, I don't like that. I think they're simply for
diversity, biodiversity.
Right, it could be diversity, but then even it is for consumerism. But I still congratulate Feng for the realism film that he tried to come up with. I think that China needs that. And like Ling said, we are still a nation trying to cope with the past, a very traumatic past, and healing is not ended yet. And Feng contributes to that very healing process with these great films, with these realism films.
When we discuss the release of Youth by Feng Xiaogang, the latest masterpiece, I was impressed by an editorial of Global Times that made comments on the issue of sensitivity for both the censors and for the movie directors. And he would somehow describe the psyche as a new normal. They should take, I mean, the movie directors should take the censorship as a normal part of their production, whilst the administration of movies should not be over-responsive, should not respond excessively to some of the so-called sensitive issues. So what do you think of the boundaries between these two groups across the aisle? I mean, this is a sensitive issue. However, it is part of the reality here for the movie makers.
Well, I think that Chinese, when we talk about censorship here in China, we need not forget about the historical context from which the Chinese cinema emerges since the 1920s. Chinese cinema has always been, ever since the 1905, the first day of Chinese film being screened. It starts from consumerism and quickly developed towards this very propaganda for saving the nation because of war, because of the ideological fight between the communists and nationalists. So film become a major ideological tool for propaganda and for educational purposes, for edification. And so in this sense, I think that censorship is not a Chinese thing. It comes from the former Soviet Union, but then Hollywood also implements its own censorship. Like the difference is, I think, it's the industry that is censoring its films. The industry itself is censoring. There is an organization that tries to censor, that tries to tell, and because we don't have a rating system, and so you have to make a film appealing to all kinds of audiences. And Hollywood, with the rating system, you censor or you don't censor, but then your film will be rated as PR guided, say PG-13, and so it's still censored.
Right. Perhaps we should discuss more the issue of commercialization and entertainment instead of politics. In that way, box office would witness a bumper harvest. Thank you for being with us. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.